Good Vach, everybody. Tonight is a continuation of an Orthodox Union program. I'm Frank Buchweitz, the National Director of Community Services for the Orthodox Union, and we have presented this program in several communities within the greater New York area as well as around the country. It is our pleasure to join with Rabbi Olbaum at Nachlas Yitzchok and members of this Kehillah in this, what we anticipate will be a very informative and educational evening. The Orthodox Union has a program, a national initiative on Tefillah. And this initiative is extremely important. And we would like to expand it not just to programs in shuls, but as well as schools. For example, when we all went to yeshiva, elementary yeshiva, because we hopefully were continuing our learning today. We all learned how to daven, but we had no idea of what we were saying. It was a matter of communication, and sometimes the old expression, what we have here is a failure to communicate, a famous expression, exists with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we have to improve our communication skills. On the flyer outside, we have a number of different materials, which if you didn't take on the way in, please help yourself to on the way out. Basically, materials on the Tefillah initiative. One is a booklet of articles in terms of making our Tefillos more personal and meaningful, which is the theme for this evening. Please help yourself. Wonderful articles have been carefully culled, carefully selected from the websites and which are available for chizuk, to provide that chizuk for everyone. Please help yourself. If we're short, we'll be happy to make copies. If you've signed in, indicate that to the OU staff that's present here this evening. In addition to the booklet, on a weekly basis, if you go to oucommunity.org, we started this past year Tefillah tips, one-page tips, which can be replicated by synagogues, which can be duplicated, and many shuls do this. In addition, you can download it on a weekly basis. We started with Musaf of Shabbos. We then went to Kabbalah Shabbos, and then to Shachris of Shabbos. So please find the weekly tip. It is prepared by Rabbi Epstein of Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and it's very informative, plus it will give you insight into the different tefillos that are recited. In addition, we have made a concerted effort and worked together with Shema Yisrael, which is out of Lakewood, and there's a Tefillah booklet, which you're welcome to purchase at a discounted price through the OU. It costs $25. It begins very simply and becomes extremely complex very quickly. It's a guide which can be used in a shul. It could be a guide that can be used for self-study, and it goes through slichus, and it becomes extremely informative, and ask that if you are going to purchase this, and we've had communities throughout the country that have participated in this as an educational tool and as a self-learning tool. We also encourage yeshivas and day schools to include more so the understanding of tefillah in their curriculum so that the kids don't do it by rote. We are also right now completing a videotape. And in the video, which we will have online probably within the month, is a split screen of someone who is saying Shema Yisrael in a very big rush, not very much involved in it, questioning of kavana, one would say, and the other person is saying the Shema Yisrael with tremendous concentration, kavana, and you could see the person is involved in it. The goal is to show how quickly the time elapses. So we have the split screen with a timer. The person who's saying Shema in a hurry, and the other one who's saying it taking his time. The time differential is very slight. What's the rush? Where are we going? There's a big difference in communication. The communication factor is really something that we would like you to strengthen, and we find that communication can lead to machlokas. When a shul may have a problem, it's usually not a problem of finances, even though we are in that pasha. The machlokas is usually as a result of communication, where we use our words and say the wrong things to people, where we can easily offend people. A machlokas can destroy a shul. It can destroy a Beis Hamikdash. So we have to be very careful with the words that we say and how we say it and to whom we say it. Whether it's our spouse, whether it's our neighbor, whether it's our friend, whether it's a business person, we're role models for our children. So in terms of our communication and the words we say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they also should be said very thoughtfully, very carefully, and not through mumbling or rote or in a rush, because it's very hard to understand what's being said when it's just blurted out and there is no kavana, there's no communication. And if we want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to respond to what we are asking of God, then we should be doing so in a proper manner. One more brief announcement. It's my pleasure to note some of the senior officials and officers who are residents of Queens here today, especially our former president and chairman of the board, who's now chairman of Kashrus, Harvey Blitz. And Gus Jacobs, our senior leader as well, is here. And it's his fan club. And all of the other officers that are present, including our Frank Snitow and Chief Operating Officer David Frankel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming this evening. Every presentation will be approximately 20 minutes. Otherwise, we could be here all night. Whether justice can be done in that time is a different story, but in speaking with every one of our distinguished all-star cast, we think that we will be able to do justice to a very complicated and difficult subject. We also want to mention that there's some material on Shema Yisrael which has been placed on the front tables. Help yourself, Kavanosh Kriya Shema, as well as brachas. So without any further ado, and we are not going to go into long introductions with all of our speakers because they are all well known, Baruch Hashem. Rav Moshe Schwerd, we ask that he come up.
Good vach. Posen b'chvod Achsanya. I'd like to thank the Orthodox Union and the Vada Rabbanim of Queens for sponsoring tonight's symposium, making our tefillos more meaningful and personal. And of course, Kilas Nachlas Yitzchok and Rabbi Obam Shlita for hosting us. I was wondering what I could possibly add to tonight's illustrious speakers. But then it occurred to me, perhaps I can share a perspective that many of you can identify with, because like many of you, I spend a large part of my day in the workplace, and therefore face the same types of challenges and opportunities that you do. Let me start with the story. It was a Motzoai Shabbos, and Shimon sees his friend Ruvain, and he says, Ruvain, you weren't in shul today. The Rav darshaned and told us exactly where in Shmona Esrei, if we have kavana for our parnasa, we're guaranteed to be answered. And Ruvain said, that's great. Inexplicably, he didn't ask where that was. Shimon couldn't believe it. He said to him, he goes, "Aren't you going to ask me where?" So Reuven said, "No, it's not necessary. I think about my parnasa throughout Shemona Esrei." The point or the problem is that sometimes we're so consumed with what we need that we waste our opportunity to get what we need to daven. Over the last couple of weeks, I've spoken to a number of people to try to figure out why exactly it is that we find tefillah so challenging. Some really told me that the reason that tefillah is so challenging is it doesn't speak to them. They find their connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through tzedakah, through chesed, through Talmud Torah. Others essentially believe that tefillah works, just not theirs. They'll wait in line for hours in Eretz Yisrael to get a bracha from a gadol. They'll fly out to Eretz Yisrael to ask somebody to daven for them, but yet they daven Shemona Esrei in 2 minutes flat. Why? Obviously because they feel that they can't affect anything with their tefillah. So what I want to do is spend the first couple of minutes examining whether or not this is correct, whether or not there's any validity to this, and then move on to a practical solution. You have Mar Makomo sheets. I'm just going to read a couple of them. Vayipach, and I'll call out the number when it's important. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim vayiyah adam lenefesh chaya. The Torah tells us that Hashem blew a neshama into man and made him into a nefesh chaya. The Targum explains nefesh chaya is a ruach memalala. He gave him the power of speech. Man was given the power of speech, and that made him into a nefesh chaya. The Maharal explains that the power of speech is the bridge that fuses the neshama and the guf, the ruchni and the gashmi. And he adds that giving man the power of speech is our completion or the culmination of creation. In Mar Mokum number 3, the Maharal writes, Ki ha'adam tzuraso chibra neshama hasichlis v'haguf biyachad. Man is the fusion between body and soul. This expresses itself with the idea that man can speak. Shehu haneshama emaguf. That's the reality. The culmination of man's creation is man's ability to speak. The Maharal goes on to explain. He says, when a baby is born, the last thing that happens is the malach hits him in the mouth. Malach hits him in the mouth, which invests him with the ability to speak. And that hakah, that smack, investing with the ability to speak, completes man. And then he borrows the concept from Shabbos, makah b'patish. When somebody is building something on Shabbos, he's chayav for that last blow, because that last blow turns something into a kli. So too, that last blow that the malach gives to the baby as he exits his mother, investing with the power of speech, creates the man, finishes his creation. Cain, Gmar Tzuraso, Shehu Chai Medaber, the conclusion of his creation, making him a speaking entity. Hu Nasa Al Yedei Gmar Piv, it's by forming the mouth. Shesham Koach Hadabri, because that's where he can speak from. V'hagmar hi ha'aka, it's that blow. V'sham Nigmar V'nasa Adam. This blow, by investing him with the power of speech, completes man. So speech is critical. It's essential to man. Speech, the ability to communicate, makes us into a nefesh chaya, into an adam, makes us alive. However, in Mar Mokum number 4, Rav Schwab asks in Eisen Akasha, if man was created alone, without woman, to whom was man intended to speak? V'yesh lahavin, harei od lo nivra ba'olam shum medaber. Nobody else could speak. V'lama nivra im koach hadibur. Im mi yadaber. Why did Adam need that power to communicate if there was nobody to communicate with? And he answers, Umuchach mizeh, she'ikr nesinas koach hadibur ba'adam, haisa letzorach she'yadaber imboro b'tfila. He answers that this proves that the power of speech was given to man to communicate with Hashem, to daven. So what we see is that man is man because he has the ability to speak. This is who we are, but it's the ability not to speak to one another, but ideally to speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Ben Yoyada echoes this in Mara Mokum number 5. It gets a little complicated here, but he points out that if you write out the word Adam bimiluo, we spell Adam Aleph Daled Mem, but if you wrote out the letters, so you would write the letter Aleph, Aleph Lamed Pei. The hidden part of the Aleph is the Lamed and the Pei. The Daled is a Lamed and a Tuf. The Mem has 2 Mems. If you look at the osios that are hidden in the word Adam, they form the word Mispalel. In Mar Mokum number 5, he writes that the essence of man is mispalel, is to daven. Demili ha'adam hu osios mispalel. Why? Because ha'adam tzarech lios mispalel tamid. A man should daven all the time. There's no way getting around it. We're pre-wired. We're supposed to be davening all the time. So how can someone feel that tefillah doesn't talk to him? How can someone feel that he can connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu outside the parameters of tefillah? Man is only man because he has the ability to speak, to communicate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To deny the importance of tefillah is to deny man's humanity. Rav Yerucham Levovitz addresses probably the most fundamental question about tefillah. Why does tefillah work? Mamanashach. If I deserve something, isn't Hashem going to give it to me even if I don't ask? And if I don't deserve it, how is asking going to get it for me? He offers an answer that some might find surprising. He points back to the beginning of creation and the pasuk which tells us that God created the vegetation and it stood at the ground ready to sprout forth, but it didn't because Hashem didn't make it rain. The pasuk says, Ki lo himtir Hashem Elokim ala aretz. God did not make it rain. Why? And the pasuk explains, V'odam ayin lavod es ha'adama. Rashi explains that man wasn't there to daven. God did not make it rain. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't make it rain because Adam HaRishon had not yet davened for the rain. But why? So Rabbi Yerucham writes in Maramokum number 8, Hinei ze yesod bebriya. This is a fundamental precept. She'ein nosnin shum davar below tefillah. You don't get anything without davening for it. This is astounding, the great power of tefillah. From the beginning of time, when God created the world, this was the rule. Everything is standing ready to sprout forth. But nothing will sprout out of the ground. You'll get nothing. Not in the physical or the spiritual sphere. You get nothing ad yavo ha'adam, until man comes. Hashem doesn't give you anything. You have to take it. How? Ubamahu lokam halohu betfila. You take it by davening. He explains that it's a t'nai in creation, that even if you deserve something, you don't get it unless and until you daven for it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't make it rain until Adam HaRishon davened for it to teach us that just as Hashem stood ready to give us the crops, to make them sprout, but still he waited for Adam HaRishon to ask for it, so too anything that we deserve, that Hashem is waiting to give to us, he's not going to give to us unless we ask for it. So how critical is tefillah? What we see is you can deserve a lot of things because of your ma'aseh of chesed and stuck and because of your Talmud Torah, but you're still not going to get it until you daven for it. But perhaps you're still troubled with the notion that while HaKadosh Baruch Hu listens to tefillos, he doesn't listen to your tefillos. That's simply not true, and there are many proofs to this. I'm going to offer two, and they're quite compelling. The Gemara in Nachlas tells us that the mother of the Kohen Gadol would visit the Orei Miklat. She would visit the place where the murderers, the accidental murderers, resided, and sort of bribe them so that they wouldn't daven for the death of the Kohen Gadol, her son. The Ben Yoyada asks, why in the world was she nervous about their tefillos? Vim Tomar, tefillah zu, this is Maramokum number 10, shel rotseach. It's a rotseach. Yes, he's a rotseach. He's an accidental murderer, but a murderer nonetheless. Ma osa, ubema nachsheva shetia ritzuya va'ola lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You think his tefillos are going to be rotzei, that God's going to listen to his tefillos? V'halo al kol panim zeh ha'maspalo rotseachu umos lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're murderers, and their tefillos should be mos, repulsive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But yet we see that there's a concern that even this repulsive tefillah, a tefillah for the death of the Kohen Gadol, is listened to. The mother of the Kohen Gadol understands that no matter how low the person, no matter how low the tefillah, Hashem listens to us when we talk to him. And therefore, she's got to go and nip it in the bud. She's got to go and convince him, don't daven against my son. Another proof. On Yom Kippur, one day a year, the Kohen Gadol is allowed to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And when he finishes his service, and we're not sure if he made it, if he didn't do it well, he may not be coming out. He's allowed to offer a short tefillah as he exits the Kodesh HaKadoshim, standing between, at least in the Bayesheni, between the two curtains that divide the Kodesh HaKadoshim and the Kodesh, and he offers a very, very short tefillah. And at the end of the tefillah, he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please don't listen to the tefillah of the Ovrei Drachim. Who are these Ovrei Drachim? They're travelers. And you know what they're davening for? For there not to be rain. Because it's not good for their travel. It makes it more difficult. These people are so selfish, they don't care about the economy. They lived in an agricultural society. If there was no rain, there wouldn't be any food. Poverty is going to abound, but that's not their problem because travel is inconvenient. So they're davening for there not to be rain. And yet, Hashem listens to their tefillos, and the proof is that the Kohen Gadol understands that if Hashem grants their tefillos, the consequences to Klal Yisrael could be catastrophic. So on Yom Kippur, when he finishes his avoda, he has to counter their tefillos with a tefillah of his own, saying, these people's tefillos, please don't listen to. Clearly, Hashem listens to everyone's tefillos. But you may ask that there is a Gemara, which Rashi quotes ala Torah, that the tefillos of a tzaddik ben tzaddik are more likely to be accepted than that of a tzaddik ben rasha. That's what the Gemara seems to say. So aren't there levels? Aren't there tiers? Doesn't that mean that not everybody's tefillos are accepted the same way? Perhaps. But that doesn't mean that Hashem doesn't listen to anybody's tefillos. That doesn't mean that Hashem's not going to listen to your tefillos. And that doesn't mean that your tefillos are still not vital for you to get what you're worthy of getting. But in any case, that's not what the Gemara means anyway. The Torah Tamima points out the Gemara cannot be taken literally. It can't mean that there's this concept of schus avos, that if somebody davens and his father was a tzaddik, his tefillah is going to be answered, and your tefillah won't if your father wasn't a tzaddik. It can't mean that, because Rabbi Akiva, who was the son of a ben Gerim, he was a descendant of Gerim, his tefillah was accepted, and other Tanoim's tefillahs were not. So they all point out that the Gemara doesn't mean that. What does the Gemara mean? That's really a topic for another day. We only have 20 minutes. But Rav Tzadok explains clearly in Maramokum number 17 that that's just not the pshat in the Gemara. Ve'ein ritzonim lomar mitzad kibbalat tefillah b'schus avosav. There is no such thing that God is going to listen to your tefillah simply because of schus avos. Ki Hashem yisbarach shomea tefillos kol peh v'karov l'chol karov. Hashem listens to each and every one of our tefillos. That's not what the Gemara means, because Hashem listens to each and every one of us. So how come some people think Hashem just doesn't listen to their tefillos? Presumably it's because they've davened fervently for something and Hashem hasn't granted their request. This leads them to the conclusion it must be that Hashem's not listening to their tefillos. The Gemara in Eruvin says the following: Zocha ta'avas libo nasatalo, which means if we're Zocha, Hashem will grant the desires of our heart. And then the Gemara says, Lo zacha, if we aren't meritorious, va'areshes sfasov balmanata. Hashem gives us exactly that which we requested. Again, if we're not zocha, then we get exactly what we asked for. So how many people want to sign up for that? That sounds like a pretty good deal. The Maritz Chayes explains the Gemara on the basis of a medrash that discusses what happened at the consecration of the first Beis HaMikdash. Shlomo HaMelech gets up and he davens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu at the consecration of the Beis HaMikdash, and he says, please, please Hashem, when Goyim come and daven to you, give them precisely what they daven for. Whatever they daven for, fulfill their request, because that will instill within them the belief that there is a God listening to their tefillos. But not so with the Jewish people. Shlomo says, Tedas Levavo. Evaluate our prayers against the true wishes of our heart. What does that mean? It means reevaluate our request against the consequences and ramifications of granting that which we've asked for. And if it's not in our best interest, deny the request. In Maramokum number 18, he writes, Ubenachri ksiv v'nasata k'chol asher yikra elecha. By a guy, whatever he asks for, give it to him. Give it to him, even though ultimately it may not be in his best interest. V'gam kan, this is the pshat in our Gemara. Im zacha, if we're worthy, then nosen lo tavas libo. You give the desire of your heart. What does everybody really want for themselves? You want what's in your best interest. Hainu rak kafi machshavto latova. You want what's in the best interest, what ultimately will be in your best interest. However, but if the Jews request something which would ultimately be not in their best interests, al titein lo, don't give it to him. The Gemara means that if we're zocha, Hashem determines whether our bakoshos are in our best interests, and if they are, He grants them. And if they're not, He doesn't grant them. And if we're not zocha, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu listens to our bakashos and gives us exactly what we've asked for, even though they're nearly not in our best interest. Because the truth is, although we're required to daven, we don't really know what's in our best interest. We don't really know what we want. And therefore, often we add this override to our tefillos. Please, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is what I want, but only if it's going to be latova. When we daven for something, we actually rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu not to give us what we've asked for, if it ultimately is not going to be in our best interests. And that's why we add the word latova after we say HaKadosh Baruch Hu, fulfill the requests of my heart. Latova. Please, please, ignore me if what I've asked for is really not in my best interest, because I know that only you know what's really in my best interest. So look at the koach of the Yetzer Hara. Isn't it ironic that he fills us with gaiva, with arrogance, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't give us what we've asked for, so he says, oh, I know what's really in my best interest. The person thinks he knows better than HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't give it to him, he comes to the conclusion, out of an abundance of low self-esteem and shiftless, that it must be that he's not worthy and therefore Hashem's not listening to his tefillos. Really, a person has to have the recognition, the self-esteem that HaKadosh Baruch Hu listens to his tefillos, and the necessary humility to recognize that if a tefillah goes unfulfilled, it was for a reason, but not because Hashem didn't hear it. Rav Tzadok says this explicitly. A person has to believe that Hashem listens to all his tefillos, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu may not fulfill your bakashos, because Hashem wants what's in your best interest. Look at Ma'ar Mokum number 19. The Dover Zet Sarech Emuna Gedola. She'afal pi she'einu roa kabbalas tfilaso v'asiyas ritzonu. Even when Hashem denies your request, im kol zeh yamen she'Hashem isbarach shomei tfilas kol peh. You have to believe that Hashem is actually listening to you. V'al derech shomarnu lahamin gam achshav. You have to believe hashgachaso yisbarach al kol echad rak letov. God is watching over us, wanting the best for us. Sometimes it appears to us, in our limited capacity, that God, by not fulfilling our requests, is not really looking out for us. Just the opposite. God is listening to each and every one of us, every one of our tefillos. This is a principle of our faith. No matter how small we seem to appear, God watches over us. Just like he looks at the greatest of the Gedolim. Because to God, we're all the same, because after all, we're all his children. So what do we know? We know that we're wired for tefillah. We're a nefesh chaya, we're an adam, we're mispalel. We know that Hashem listens to each and every one of us, no matter how low the person, no matter how low the tefillah. And we know that tefillahs are vital to get what you deserve. And yet the Gemara tells us that which we know, we don't need the Gemara to tell us, that tefillah needs constant chizuk. Why? So Rav Schwab in a Sefer in Tefillah in Ma'ar Mokum number 20, and I put this in one in English, explains that the problem is that man doesn't realize he's talking directly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When we daven, we're standing in front of the king, and we're speaking directly to him. He writes, when we're mispalel, we're not usually aware that we're talking directly to Hashem Yisbarach. So here, and he's talking about when we say the words V'karvenu malkeinu le'avodasecha, we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for help. We actually daven to Hashem for help in elevating our tefillah to the level of avodasecha, your service, in which we are clearly aware that we are communicating directly with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So allow me, if the fundamental problem with our davening is our difficulty in recognizing that we're speaking directly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, perhaps we can improve our Shmona Esreis by working on our tefillah outside the context of our set tefillos. Let me explain. It isn't easy to find Hashem in the workplace. The pressure, the pace, the stress, the workload, it's a challenge. But we can use those obstacles, those challenges, those frustrations as a springboard to enhance our tefillah and to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For example, before you go into a meeting, stop and just say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help me out here. When you come out of the meeting and it worked okay, Hashem, thank you very much. When the phone rings and you have that caller ID and it's that nudnik to drive you crazy again, say, please Hashem, make him go away. No, don't leave a voicemail. When the phone doesn't ring, Hashem, please make a client call. Hashem, let me get the deal. Let me get the job. Let me get the sale. Hashem, make things go smoothly. Hashem, make things go quickly. Hashem, let me get home on time, and so on and so forth. These tefillos will instill within us the realization that our success, big and little over the course of the day, is truly out of our hands, and only in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands. And if we take the time over the course of the day to speak to Hashem, we'll begin to fully appreciate that we're actually speaking to Hashem, and He's listening. By training ourselves to ask for assistance over the course of the day and thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu afterwards, you train ourselves that we're not only forging a bond with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we're training ourselves to daven the tefillos better as well. Because by talking to Hashem, we influence ourselves to understand that there's a direct communication. We're speaking to Hashem, and He's listening. And that's going to help us with our Shmona Esrei as well. And I believe that this is what Rav Chaim Friedlander writes in the Sifsei Chaim in the last few Ma'ar Makomos. In Ma'ar Makom 21, he explains that the Gemara told us that in the old days, in the time of the Gemara, there were set tefillos that people said over the course of the day. There was a tefillah before you went to the doctor. There was a tefillah before you went into a situation where there was possible peril. There was a tefillah before you measured your crops. He actually decries the fact that we don't say these tefillos anymore. But what was the purpose of these tefillos? So he writes in 21, those tefillos that were instituted over the daily events. Make us closer to Hashem. V'notin b'libeinu es hargasha, and they implant within us the feeling, the realization, sha'Hashem Yisbarach nimtza itanu, that God is with us, v'anu medabrim elav, and we're actually speaking to Him. Sha'al yedei adibur al Hashem Yisbarach gam al advarim katanim b'chol sha'os hayom, by speaking to God about all these little things over the course of the day, nargish b'nechochas Hashem b'chol eis, bein b'shas tefillah, bein shalo b'shas tefillah. We recognize that there's God. He's with us. And we're speaking directly to Him. Talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu instills within us the realization that we need Hashem's help constantly. And not only are we davening, but we're also inculcating ourselves with the reality that we're talking directly to the Melech Malchei Amlachim. In Ma'ar Makom number 23, Rav Friedlander suggests that we each take on a Kabbalah, as a minimum, 3 times a day, to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help us with the day's events. No matter what we do, no matter what we need, no matter what we want, we sit and we stop and we talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and ask Him. And he says, by the way, echoing the words of Rabbi Yerucham, you need to do that because the only way to get what you deserve is by asking for it. And finally, in Ma'ar Makom number 24, Rav Friedlander, after explaining the greatness of the Nusach HaTfilah, the wisdom of Anshe Knesses Agdola, what's all embedded in our Shmona Esrei, then tells us that by using our own words, by davening for our own particular needs, that's going to help our tefillos fresh and new rather than old and rote. And look what he writes. Yitochein, it's possible, lehispalol bepeh, to daven with your mouth, v'lo lahargish belev, but not to feel hischachus be'emuna v'hischaskus b'bitachon, sha'akol rak me Hashem Yisbarach. You could be asking Hashem and not even realize that everything comes from Hashem. This is the only source to turn to. Rak, kasher ponim el Hashem Yisbarach, except if you turn to Hashem, umevakshim imenu b'sfas hadibur hapshuta shalonu, but if you turn to Hashem and in just plain English, speak to Hashem. Just use commonplace vernacular and speak to Hashem and tell Him what you need. V'gam mishtamshim ba midei pam b'milei shonos, not write a text, a formulaic statement, but rather, speak to Him. You change the words, change the things that you're discussing. Al yedei kach margishim batamid hischachos. Then your davening will be fresh and new. If we accustom ourselves to ask for Hashem's help throughout the day, throughout the day's events and challenges, we'll also sensitize ourselves to the fact that when we are davening, we are talking to Hashem, He is listening and evaluating whether or not our requests are really in our best interests. May we all be zocheh to improve our tefillos and to together daven at the Bayis Shlishi and see with our own eyes the fulfillment of the pasuk in Yeshaya, v'haviyosem al har kodeshi v'simachtem b'veis tefilasi, ki beisi beis tefillah yikarei l'chol amen.